Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Niall Brolcháin is my name. I'm from NUIG Galway, and I'm working on the Care Peat project. I'm ably joined by my esteemed colleague Terry Morley, who's going to be doing the note taking for this session. So we had discussions on this earlier. Is this the graveyard session, or have they left the best wine to last? I think it's the latter. And I think we've got a really interesting session lined up. We've got 6 really good speakers. And I'm going to introduce Ken Bucke to you in a minute for his presentation, followed by Caroline Lalor, Munoo Prasad, Hedda, Gary Lanigan, and finally Michael Fitzmars. He'll be the last speaker of the various 8 sessions. So without further ado, I think I'd like to hand over to Ken Bucke. His presentation is called Afforestation on Peatland, the Past, the Present, and Lessons for the Future. He's with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. So Ken, are you there?
I'm here, Neil, thanks. I'll try to share my screen here now.
The floor is yours.
Thanks. Okay, hopefully you can see that okay. So as Neil said, my name is Ken Bucke. I'm an inspector in the Environment section of the Forest Service in the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. So those of you who are not familiar with the sector, the department is responsible for the implementation of forestry related legislation for national forestry policy and for the running of the grant schemes that you might be familiar with. So just to give you a brief background on the current situation with the National Forest Estate, there's about 11% land coverage in forestry in Ireland, and the sector contributes about €2.5 billion to the national economy. It's divided really in two between state ownership and private ownership. About half of the National Forest Estate is owned by one company, Coillte, which is the state forestry company, and the other half is owned by about 21,000 private landowners, the vast majority of whom are farmers. And there's about 3.2 million cubic meters harvested annually. So it's a significant land use and a significant sector in the country. Just to give you some history on the National Forest Estate and how we got to where we are today, I suppose. Afforestation started not long after the state and the foundation of the state, if you like, through the 20s and into the 1940s. And there was a slight lull in afforestation in the 40s, but it really ramped up through the 1950s. And the 1946 Forestry Act was in place for a long time. I'll talk about that in a second, but that was the first sort of significant piece of legislation. So as the state carried on with afforestation, really targeting unproductive, our land was considered, I suppose, unproductive for agriculture, and the view was to create or stimulate some rural economy. But the state continued planting right up until sort of the late 1980s when Coillte was formed as a company in its own right with the commercial remit, and Coillte carried on doing some afforestation into the early 90s, quite often in partnership with landowners. But they kind of stopped afforesting, and by afforestation, I mean the creation of new forests and greenfield sites, if you like. In this, Coillte ceased that in the 90s. But in 1981, the first of the private grant-aided schemes started, and that was known as the Western Package, and that was targeted at 9 Western Seaboard counties. And again, these areas that were targeted for planting were really kind of the land that was kind of considered unproductive agricultural land. And again, the objective was to stimulate the rural economy. But as we got into the 90s, then the private afforestation really ramped up, and they were more and more agricultural land, mineral soils, grass, rush fields, that kind of thing started to get planted. And guidelines around forest practice came in the early 90s, and then there were much more significant ones introduced in 2000, and they've been updated then more recently, and I'll talk about that in a second. So as a result of the history of the way the planting happened, you can see here that about 40% of the National Forest Estate is on soils that we would say are 100% peat soils. But you can see disproportionately, I suppose, that the forest land on peat soils in the public estate or in Coillte ownership is much higher than it is in the private sector. And that's just because Coillte would have inherited all of that land that was originally planted by the state since the foundation of the state. So as a result here, you'll see, those of you familiar with Ireland will be able to identify the upland areas here that were coincident, I suppose, with the planting. So the darker green areas, you can see where the majority of the planting are, things like the Wicklow Mountains, the Slieve Bloom, Slieve Octies, and the west of Ireland as well. So I mentioned the 1946 Forestry Act, and there was a condition in that act that required replanting after every felling license. So any felling license that the department issued, there was a replanting obligation on them all. It was very black and white. There wasn't a whole lot of room for flexibility. And surprisingly, that act was in place right up until as recently as 2017, when the 2014 Forestry Act was commenced. But the new 2014 Act and the SI 191 of 2017 allows us a lot more flexibility now when dealing with planting license, replanting after felling licenses. There's more flexibility with restructuring and changing species and strategic removal and that kind of thing. We'll just talk about that a little bit more in a second. So in line with that, then there are some key documents that we apply to all forestry license applications. So any afforestation and any felling is subject to license by the department under the 2014 Act. So a new document was published in 2017 called the Land Types for Afforestation. There are also environmental requirements for afforestation, new standards for felling, and the felling and reforestation policy too, which is an important document as well in with regard to peat. So the land types was work that was done with our colleagues with Teagasc, and it sets out a scoring system, a plant-based scoring system, which objectively removes a range of site types which would be deemed unsuitable for afforestation. Before this, there was a requirement at all times, that a minimum yield class requirement for planting was a yield class of 14, but it could be quite subjective, and it could lead to arguments between foresters and inspectors on the ground as to what land would produce what yield class and everything else. So this kind of took all of that argument out of it, and it's based on the Hill and Ellenberg vegetation classification scoring system.
2 minutes remaining, Ken.
Okay, thanks. So we had the environmental requirements as well, set out some new requirements with regard to setbacks, in particular around from water. But I mentioned the felling and reforestation policy as well. And this is a new policy that came. You can see the date here is May 2017. The 2017 SI was published in May, and the department published this pretty much the day after. It was ready to go. We were waiting for the legislation. So this allows us the ability, and it makes department policy to restructure forests where we can. We can strategically remove them. And Hedda will be speaking later on. And this department policy and the legislation that we have now can facilitate the work that Coillte are doing in restoring some of these areas. So I'd say, like, the past, I suppose, is what it is. It's but I think for the future, we have now the land types for afforestation, which removes us, which prohibits planting on these kind of important bog habitats. But the existing national forest estate has been created over the past 100 years or so, and forestry and the production of timber is a long-term crop. So change takes time as a result. But I think the sector, the future is looking better for the sector, and forestry can be done a better way, I think. But I do believe there's a positive way forward now with the new legislation we have and the new department policies. I know the presentation is short, but my contact details there if anyone wants to get in contact with me directly afterwards. Yeah, thanks.
No, thanks very much, Ken, for a very thought-provoking talk. The issue about site types and very interesting. And I noted in the chat earlier, Ray Flynn was talking about the fact that forestry is not kind of native to blanket bogs, really. So there's a big debate there. But moving swiftly along, we have a very interesting discussion now. Something very dear to my heart. Caroline Lalor is responsible for talking to us about FarmPEAT. The title of her talk is FarmPEAT, Farming with Nature in the Midland Raised Bog Landscape. So Caroline, are you there? The floor is yours. So all you need to do is unmute yourself, I think, and off you go.
Thanks, Niall. Thanks for the reminder. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect.
Thanks, Isolt. Thanks a million for asking us to present at this gathering. It's been a fantastic gathering so far, really enjoying it. I'm here to talk about the FarmPEAT project. As Niall said, my name is Caroline Lalor, and the FarmPEAT project is Farm Payments for Ecology and Agricultural Transitions. It's an EIP, a European Innovation Partnership. We got funding from the Department of Agriculture, 1.2 million for 2 years. So we started in April this year, and we run until April 2023. So very briefly, I won't dwell on this slide for too long, but just to give you an overall view of the structure. So obviously the farmers are at the heart of it. You know, we're setting up an agri-environmental scheme. So the farmers are the land managers and they own the land that we are hoping to work with. We have an operational group, which is made up of the partners on the project. So we have Ummer's Community Development, Irish Rural Link, the Pearl Mussel Project and Wetland Surveys Ireland. And we have accountants there as well, O'Connor and Pine. So Paddy Crushell, many of you know, he was instrumental in really getting this project off the ground and is huge support to us. We have a fantastic steering group as well. Many of you are here and many of you spoke today and yesterday. And just a shout out to you. Thanks very much for all your support. So just to give you an outline of the project's aims and what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to do it, I suppose that's my main aim today in my 8 minutes. So we want to work with farmers to design and trial a locally adapted results-based scheme for the Irish Midland landscape. And of course, the Irish Midlands are characterised by these beautiful raised bogs. We want to work with the farmers to design the scheme, and we're trialing it really over the 2 years. So we're going to, you know, we want to share with the farmers what we're trying to achieve and why we think it's so important, but also we want the farmers to tell us what they want to achieve and how they see it could work, how they see it could work, or what they think could work in this landscape. Locally adapted as well. I loved what Colm Gavin said yesterday when he said the results-based approach gives the farmer control, you know, and I suppose we'll be following in that line as well. So when we have a common goal with a farmer, you know, if the farmer has his own idea or her own idea as to how to achieve that common goal, that's absolutely fine with us. And also locally adapted, I suppose, from the perspective, like some of the national schemes, agri-environmental schemes, have measures which might not be very suited to, let's say in this case, a peat soil. So we're working with the Department of Agriculture, so we'll be feeding back our thoughts there on how these schemes can be more locally adapted. We want to design a scheme that will incentivise improved management of habitats on peat soils, benefiting climate, biodiversity and water. So the climate, I suppose, aspect is the carbon, you know, carbon sequestration and reduced carbon emissions. So that's our main aim, but with the co-beneficiaries would be biodiversity and water. They're all interlinked anyway, and obviously we don't want to leave them out. I'll talk a bit more about the scheme in a second. We want to reward farmers for maintaining and improving the local environment. And again, that goes back to the results-based approach, where the farmer is rewarded for the result, no matter when, you know, whether those actions that resulted in that result took place years ago or are going to take place in the years to come. And also we want to increase awareness of the importance of raised bog habitats and the sustainable use, the importance of the sustainable use of peatland soils in these areas. And I suppose, you know, in all the IPs, a big part of them is increased awareness, and we want to increase the awareness of the importance of the raised bog habitats. We've heard so much about it over the last couple of days, but also the vulnerability of these habitats. They're so important and can give us so much in terms of carbon sequestration, but they're hugely vulnerable, and we want to increase awareness of that. So this, just very briefly, is a slide showing our project areas. We have 8 project sites in the Midlands, kind of centred here in Offaly. We have 2 in Roscommon, 1 in Westmeath and 1 here in Kildare on the border. So you can go to our website and look at all of these areas in more detail. We have maps there if you want to look at them in more detail. This is Dangan, one of our project areas in County Offaly. And, you know, I suppose on the surface it looks nice and neat. There's your raised bog and it's surrounded by largely agricultural land with some forestry. This is our project site boundary. It's a 500-metre buffer zone from the raised bog, and that's the same for all of our project areas. And I suppose we feel by working in this area here, in this sort of transitional area, you know, anything that happens here is going to have an impact on the raised bog. So we feel if we can improve things hydrologically here in these areas, it'll help those raised bogs achieve their conservation objectives. But also anything that happens in this area is going to have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions. You can see here the same site, Dangan Bog, and this is an indicative map of the peat soils in the area. So, you know, this patch here, we'll say, of agricultural land, it's ryegrass, but it looks like it's on peat soil, so it was probably originally part of the raised bog. And so we know if it's supporting a nice crop of ryegrass, it's been drained, it's been ploughed and reseeded and probably fertilised as well, all of which are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. So whatever management occurs here will have an impact. So just to outline the results-based approach, I think Derek and Paddy outlined this very well yesterday, but just in case if anyone wasn't here yesterday, The results-based approach is a bit different to our traditional agri-environmental schemes, which have been action-based so far. And it's so an action-based approach is where a farmer in a scheme like that is paid for the action. So whether it's planting 100 meters of hedgerow or fencing, you get paid for the action, you do the action, and that's it. Whereas the results-based approach is more, you get paid for what your land is producing, what is the result of that land for nature, for carbon, for biodiversity and water. So in our case, we're designing a scoring system which will capture that, which will capture the value of the land for biodiversity, water quality and carbon. And then the higher the score that the plot achieves, the higher the nature quality, and then the higher the payment is due to the farmer.
2 minutes remaining, Caroline.
Thank you. So the scorecards are hugely important because we use the scorecards to determine the score of each plot. And so we have to make sure that those scorecards are capturing the right information. We've spent a lot of time designing the scorecards this year. It's a pilot project, it's 2 years. So this year we're testing our scoring system, and I'm sure we'll be tweaking it as we have been doing so far. So it's just a lot of effort goes into them. And of course, we're quite confident, I suppose, or a little bit quite confident, not fully confident, but we're quite confident that we're capturing the right things. But in order to test especially the carbon element, we will put out some chambers. Mark O'Connor is working with us on that. So when we have all our plots scored, we can put out some chambers to measure the greenhouse gas measurements there in high scoring plots, low scoring plots, moderate scoring plots, to make sure we're capturing the right information. Just very briefly, again, 3 plots all on peat, all in our FarmPEAT project. Just to give you an example, like this one would obviously score quite low. It is low quality and hence it'll get no payment. A moderate score indicates moderate quality and will get a moderate payment. A high quality plot like this will get a high score and high payment. And then again, the results-based payment really should be what the main source of revenue from the project to the farmer. But of course, a farmer like this here, a farmer that owns this plot of land will get no results-based payment on this plot. So what can we do for that farmer? So we have this supporting actions payment, which is really important. So for this farmer, if he wants to achieve a result on the ground, we can support his actions, which will put him in the right trajectory in that regard. So if there's an action he can do, which will improve the quality on the land, we'll support that financially. And then hopefully in the years to come, he will achieve a results-based payment. This is our idealised vision for the landscape of the Midlands of Ireland. Nice raised bog, nice transition area, all nice and wet, capturing carbon. Any past drains have been blocked and are vegetated. This land here on peat here is, I suppose, non-intensively farmed and biodiverse. The river here has been fenced off. This presumably is not on peat and is suitable for dairy. And again here, nice hedgerows capturing carbon as well. But this is the landscape which we're working with. So obviously there are challenges which we are willing to face, and education and community outreach is a huge part of our project as well. We're kind of just getting started with that at the moment. We'll be launching our educational program next month for Science Week and talking to transition years in our project areas. And again, just trying to increase awareness, the importance of raised bogs. There's something to be hugely proud of. They give us huge benefits in terms of ecosystem services. And yeah, so we'll be continuing in that regard over the next while. Keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook if you want to find out more. We will be launching our YouTube channel soon. It's up and running at the moment. We've only 2 videos there, but keep tuned, I'd say, and you'll be in for a treat there. Thank you very, very much.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Caroline. Very, very interesting talk, very interesting project, and great enthusiasm there. So we're going to move swiftly along because we're running tight on time. So the next presenter is Munoo Prasad, and he's from indeed we see his talk up there already. Peat Alternatives, should peat harvesting for Irish horticulture cease immediately? And he's hopefully talking to us about alternatives. We saw a shipload of peat compost coming in from Latvia there recently, and was highlighted in the Oireachtas. So be very interested in Munoo's talk. So over to you, Munoo.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And I would like to mention straight away that I'm not speaking as a chairman of the working group on the peat. I'm speaking on behalf of my company and my other affiliation. Can I have the next slide, please? So what has happened is that peat harvesting for horticulture was stopped abruptly, and this was indirectly as a result of High Court judgment. There's a whole lot of regulations about dual consent and things like that. So basically, there was no significant harvesting which took place in 2020 or 2021. Next slide. So this has caused a crisis in the horticultural industry. The horticultural industry is worth 470 million. It employs directly or indirectly about 17,000, 18,000 people. And 60% of the Irish, the value of the Irish horticulture depends on peat. And the government also has been very keen to promote this plant-based diets and local produce, and also expand the Irish horticulture. Next slide. So the amount of peat required for various sectors are as follows. The professional horticulture is 131,000 cubic meters. So you want to convert into ton, I suppose the factor is about 3 or 4. So it'd be 30 or 40,000 tons. The mushroom casing, the mushroom industry is very, very advanced in Ireland. It's one of the most advanced almost in the world. And the amount again is 155. So out of the total 846,000 cubic meters, about less than half is for the professional area, and the rest is for the hobby market. And the total area that would be required is about 1,700 hectares, which is less than 5% of the peat that was historically harvested in Ireland. Next slide, please. So it is internationally recognized that the Irish peat is one of the best for horticulture. And it is because of these particular climatic conditions that we have in Ireland. As a high levels of humic acid, it is very well buffered. And for mushroom casing, also it has certain type of bacteria that helps with the fructification. And also for propagation of young seedlings, you need material that will be sticky and forms a block. Next slide. So if peat is not available, what is the solution, at least in the short term? So import peat, I think, as you know, it seems absolutely crazy. Six shiploads, according to the GMI, the Growing Media Ireland, has already arrived in the island of Ireland. And it is predicted that 2 shiploads of peat will be required every month for 2022. And you can imagine the amount of diesel that will be used for transporting it from the bog to the ship, and then from unloading it as well. Next slide. So what is the solution? It's quite difficult, but one of them could be that a primary legislation is passed so that peat harvesting can continue at least for a few years, and mostly for the professional area at a decreasing level, and is monitored by an independent authority. And that's very important, because since 2005, there's talk about stopping peat harvesting. Nothing really has been done. And now it has just come very suddenly. And in the case of Germany and Holland, 2 major important countries in Europe, particularly Holland, from a horticultural point of view, they have a plan that for professional area, peat harvesting should stop by 2035. This is for professional area, and in retail, it can be even faster. Next slide. So what we feel is that the Irish peat should be available for a short period of time in sufficient quantities for the professional area, and particularly is critical for 2022. As I mentioned, that I'm going to import peat, when one of the best peats is available here. And then, the question of changing the regulations is not going to be so straightforward, but something, because of the emergency, something should be done. And it should also be remembered that the amount that is being used for horticulture is minuscule in terms of, if you look at the historical, how much peat was used, for instance, for energy production, and also for making briquettes and so on, also export of peat. So what we are saying is that the peat at the moment is currently releasing carbon dioxide due to natural wetting and drying cycles in the Irish weather as it lies there. Okay, this would have been the case in 2021 and most likely in 2020 and in 2021, and most likely in a couple of years before it can be wetted. So the question is that consideration should be given for harvesting if existing companies are interested or worker co-ops. Of course, we are not saying that you break the law. It is dependent on the government passing primary legislation to make it possible. So I'd like to emphasize that, because there's a feeling sometimes that we are telling people to go and start harvesting peat because it is lying there. And that is not the case. I would like to emphasize that very much. Next slide, please.
2 minutes remaining, Munoo.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So this just gives an example of peat breakdown under very intensive conditions. And this is a wetting and drying cycle that was done in a glass house. So you can see that depends on different types of peat, the amount of breakdown can vary a lot. Next slide, please. So what are the alternatives? The alternatives are, for instance, coir, that comes from coconut material from India and Sri Lanka and from other places, Vietnam. And it is not really a viable material in the long term. And the price has been going up a lot because a lot of it is being exported to China. Wood fiber is a material, but it can only be added as a ingredient. As you can see in this, I've given about performance and consistency, economic consideration, environmental consideration, chance of success, an additive, and as a replacement. So not all of them can be replaced 100%. Bark is a very good material, but unfortunately in Ireland, we don't have enough bark. Composted green waste, it has good potential, but very high levels of electrical conductivity. So it can only be used up to a certain level, at least in the technology that is being used at the moment. Biochar is a good material, but it's far too expensive. Sphagnum moss farming, that will take a bit of time. And then we have a whole lot of others. We have suggested reuse of peat, but the other one that we are looking at using new technology. And I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. What I would like to mention is that as regards the what should be done? Well, one of the main things is that more funding should be available for peat alternatives. And it is not the fault of the government because a lot of peat was available, so good quality peat. So there wasn't any incentive to do work, at least basic work in this area. I think we have to think outside the box. We have to think about high-tech composting, think about pyrolysis units, and also, I don't know if people are familiar with pyrolysis. You get energy and you retain all the carbon that is there, or 95% of the carbon. It is not like combustion that goes into the air, into the smoke. And one of the ideas could be that a pilot plant could be built, which could be very useful because it could also create long-term employment. The other thing that we have been talking about, that if the government passes this legislation, then the bogs that are already ready for harvesting, and as I mentioned to you, that it will be releasing carbon dioxide at the moment with the wetting and drying cycle, and this is, we are talking about the short term, over 2 or 3 years, it should be considered if there's legislation and if there is proper regulatory authorities follow all the regulations, this could be something that could be considered, because if you grow plants in this peat, you'll be growing plants, for instance, nursery stock, which will actually tap up carbon, lock up carbon in the plant, and then you'll be planted outside. So this is something food for thought. And the other, lastly, I wanted to end in a positive note. This is a trial that was done. It was published in a journal, referee journal, and was published. It was joint work with Importamona and Chagas. And it shows on the left-hand side, we have 100% peat. On the right-hand side, we have 100% composted material. The composted material was sawdust and black grain, and it was composted. And as you can see, the performance of the plant was as good as the 100% peat. But as one can say that one swallow does not make a summer. So what I would like to say that there is this potential. The potential is already there. More funding will be required if research is done, and also at much more at a basic level, something completely outside the box. Okay. So next slide, please.
If you could finish up very quickly.
Yeah, that's finished. Yeah, so thank you very much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Munoo. It's obviously a subject which is hugely topical at the moment, and one which we might get to in the Q&A. I want to move swiftly along though, because we're tight for time. Next up we have Hedda, and Hedda is from Coillte Nature, who are doing a lot of really good work at the moment. And believe it or not, I think they have about three times as much land as Bord na Móna within Coillte in terms of peatlands. So Hedda, the floor is yours if you're ready.
Great. Can you see my slide there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Perfect. So hi everyone. Yeah, my name's Hedda and I'm the outreach manager for Coillte Nature. So thanks so much for inviting us to be part of the Peatlands Gathering. I've been listening over the last 2 days, and it's been so fantastic and exciting to hear about all the different work taking place. So for anyone who doesn't know, Coillte Nature is the not-for-profit branch of Coillte, which was set up about 2 years ago. And we operate under 4 main themes, which are restoring biodiversity, afforestation with native woodlands, regenerating urban forests, and rehabilitating ecosystem services. So today I'm going to talk to you about 2 very different Coillte Nature projects, which both fit under the theme of rehabilitating ecosystem services and which focus on the ecological restoration of peatlands. So there's really only time today to give a really brief overview. So the first project I'm going to share some information about is the Wild Western Peatlands project, which is funded by Coillte and the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. And this is a large-scale project which will focus on over 2,000 hectares of Coillte land, specifically areas where pine and spruce were planted on areas of blanket bog and wet heath in the past, with the intention of creating rural employment and a timber resource. So the project will see management plans drawn up for 4 or 5 large sites, which will look at the best ways of managing sites like this into the future, taking into account the long-term impact on water quality, biodiversity and climate. The preferred option for these sites is the restoration of blanket bog and wet heath, as they're an Annex 1 habitat of international importance. However, these sites will have a range of characteristics, and in areas where this isn't possible, other approaches may be taken, such as establishing low density native woodland or leaving open areas along watercourses. So we've chosen one site to start work on in Derryclare and Connemara, which I'll talk to you about in more detail shortly. And we have a short list of other potential sites along the west, which you can see there on the map. And these sites will be finalised based on a range of criteria. So for example, proximity to a special area of conservation, but also the potential to work with a range of stakeholders such as state bodies, environmental NGOs, local communities, and other peatland restoration initiatives. So as you can see there from the map, the pilot site in Derryclare is located about 60 kilometres northwest of Galway City, and it's on the western shores of Derryclare Lough and Lough Ina. And this site also borders the Derryclare Nature Reserve, which is an area of old oak woodland managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So this property is about 560 hectares in size, and 90% of this has been planted with commercial forest, mostly conifer. So over the summer, we have been carrying out ecology, hydrology and LiDAR surveying to inform a management plan for this site. And early findings from the survey show that there is high potential for the restoration of blanket bog and wet heath, but many areas of deep peat, some over 4 meters in depth. So although the land's been highly modified by forestry activities, there are peatland species such as sphagnum mosses growing, and through rewetting and other interventions, there's potential to restore over 80% of this site to blanket bog and wet heath. So we have started some initial stakeholder consultation on this project, and The overwhelming response has been very positive. In general, people are keen to find new solutions to managing this type of peatland forest into the future. And this project is still in its early stages, but it's hoped that learnings from this pilot site at Derryclare and other wild western peatland sites will help us to develop a range of processes and solutions that can be used to manage lands like this more sustainably into the future. So now I'm going to introduce another Coillte Nature project based on a very different type of peatland ecosystem restoration. So while the Wild Western Peatlands project looks at areas of Blanca bog which were afforested with conifer plantations, this Midlands native woodland project looks at areas of raised bog which were drained and industrially harvested for peat. So as you can see from this picture, these are highly modified landscapes where the peat has been stripped away in some parts to the parent materials beneath. So this site in question is at Bonmore in County Kilkenny, close to the Tipperary border. And this project is being carried out in collaboration with Bord na Móna on their land, where the primary restoration approach that is being taken is re-wetting.
2 minutes remaining there.
However, thanks. However, there's some areas of the estate that are now high and dry. So by that, I mean the topography has changed to the extent that they naturally drain due to gravity and you need to pump water up to re-wet them. So as a remediation solution for these high and dry areas that won't re-wet, Coillte Nature is trialling the seeding and planting of native trees and shrubs, taking our lead from the natural regeneration that's happening in parts of the cutaway bogs in the region. The aim is to speed up the regeneration process and stabilise the bare peat to reduce soil erosion and carbon emissions. So over 100 trial plots have been established with a combination of seeding and planting native trees and shrub species on different peat depths to see what is the best approach going forward with this. The aim is to establish about 8% of the site with native woodland, which comes to about 206 hectares. And as I mentioned, the majority of the site is to be re-wetted, and this would result in a mosaic of different habitats. So over the summer, the Form 1 applications, Natural Impact Statement and Environmental Impact Assessment Report were submitted to the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and we're awaiting their outcome of their assessment to be able to continue with this project. So in conclusion, we have two very different projects here, which are dealing with different types of peatland, which have been modified over time by human activity in different ways. And we're working on the basis that for the Midlands Native Woodland project, it's appropriate to establish native pioneer woodland on some parts of the Midland raised cutaway bogs, but that for the Wild Western Peatlands project, it's more appropriate to remove plantation conifer forests from Western Peatland, Western Blanca bogs as much as feasible. So both projects, however, have similar aims of increasing biodiversity, reducing carbon emissions in the long run, and improving water quality and benefiting local communities. Just to say, both of these projects will have ongoing stakeholder engagement, and just looking at the range of activities being discussed here over the last 2 days, there's clearly really great potential for collaboration. So do get in touch with us, and you can find out more on the Coillte Nature website, and my email address is there, hedda.dick@coillte.ie. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I'm joined as well on the panel here today by my colleague Declan Little, who's the ecological lead for the project. So if there's any questions at the end that I can't answer, I'm sure Declan will be able to get them. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Hedda. That was a fantastic presentation, and I think quite inspiring and encouraging native woodlands, and I suppose removing and restoring for peatland which has got inappropriate forestry on it. It's what I'd hope Coillte would do. We're moving swiftly along anyway because we're tight for time. Gary Lanigan is next up. He's from Teagasc, and he's talking to us about carbon dynamics of grassland on peat. So Gary, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Niall. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a new initiative that Teagasc are undertaking, funded primarily by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and also involving the majority of the third level institutions in the country. So in terms of agriculture, we've a number of challenges. The main one being that the upcoming Climate Action Bill is going to be looking for a 51% cut in emissions up to 2030 and for net climate neutrality by 2050. It's been in the context where agricultural emissions have been on the rise since 2011, driven primarily by increase in dairy cow numbers and fertilizer use. However, as well as the agricultural inventories, there's also the land use change and forestry inventories. And probably what's not that well known in that is the role of agricultural grasslands in terms of emissions. So we look at our forestry. Forestry is generally a sink, though these are the projections out to 2030, and that sink capacity is reducing over time as we start to clear fell the forests. Our croplands are more or less a very small sink, are carbon neutral. However, our grasslands are quite a large source of CO2, and people sometimes are quite surprised about that. They say, well, oh, we thought that grasslands sequester carbon, and indeed they do. Grasslands on mineral soils sequester carbon. However, grasslands on drained peat soils emit carbon, and actually quite a lot of carbon. So the 7 million tons or so of emissions from grasslands reflect the fact that there's about 350,000 hectares of grassland on drained peat soils that are emitting quite a large per hectare level of emissions. Okay, and then we have wetlands, which include Bordnamona, cutaway peatlands, and also other peatlands that are used for either horticultural production or natural wetlands as well. And really, what we're saying here is that without a scheme whereby the water table can be raised back up, these grasslands are going to keep emitting. Okay, but of course, one of the main things we have to do is actually to constrain this. Okay, so how much are they emitting, and what are the practices that we can do to stop these losses? So if we think about it as a carbon, we talk about carbon sinks, and in fact, I like to actually generally analogize them to a sink. So if you look at a very sandy mineral soil that probably has tillage on it, for example, these sandy soils have a very low capacity to hold carbon. And if it's an arable system, there's a high level of CO2 being taken up by the crop, but also then a high level of CO2 leaving the system. If we look at a grassland system on a clay soil, clay has a high affinity to carbon, so it can store carbon in it. However, in a grassland system, you have a high level of CO2 uptake by photosynthesis by, say, the grass, and a lower level of losses out of the system. In a peatland system, though, because it's completely waterlogged, there's no aerobic decomposition occurring, so it's an anaerobic system. And because it's anaerobic and for the most part acidic, while you have low amounts of CO2 uptake, so low photosynthetic productivity, there's almost no loss out of the system. So you have a huge buildup of carbon. So if you analogize them to a sink size, your cropland on a sandy soil is a washhand basin, your peatland is a swimming pool. And you're talking about maybe 80 tons of carbon per hectare. In the sandy soil, you're talking about 1,000 to 5,000 tons of carbon per hectare in a peatland system. And because there's so much carbon within a peatland system, once you start to change the hydrology of that system and you lower the water table, then what you see is a high level of emissions. So if we look at the Tier 1 emissions by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we see that grasslands on a per hectare basis, if they are drained, are emitting around about 20 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. Croplands on peat soils, around about 30 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. And because there's this very high per hectare level of emissions, about 20 tonnes of carbon of CO2 per hectare, that is why then the 300 or 350,000 hectares of grassland on peat soils are such a large source of CO2.
2 minutes remaining there, Gary.
Right, so these are Tier 1 emissions factors. So what we're tasked with doing now is to actually get national level emission factors for these lands. And what we formed is the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, consisting of around 17 sites around the country. About 8 of these will be peatland sites. I'm working in conjunction with Caroline in FarmPEAT EIP and with Aileen in the Farm Carbon EIP source sites. And what we want to do is look at the emissions from these drained peat soils, but then also see what are the mitigation options. What happens if you simply stop fertilizing them, for example? Do you stop priming the system? And again, how high do you need to raise the water table to actually see a result in the emissions? This is the towers as they go out onto the fields, and ultimately what you should end up then with is to be able to look at the amount of carbon either emitted from the soil or taken up by the soil, and see the relationship with the water table depth. And the same with methane. We'll be monitoring methane on all these soils as well. We'll also be using 14C to look at the source of CO2 within those systems. And what we will be doing then with these sites is we'll be then combining them with measurements of grass production, for example, from pasture base. We'll be also merging them with Earth observations from the satellites. And then we'll be using biogeochemical models to end up with a value of CO2 emissions and carbon sequestration from re-wetted soils that can go into our national inventory. So that's a quick flying stop tour through the National Soil Carbon Observatory. So what we're hoping to do is then to understand the processes governing carbon loss from these soils and how we might reverse it, and to create a long-term monitoring infrastructure for the country so that we can report emissions and removals of CO2. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gary. Very, very interesting talk. And I mean, just to put things in perspective, as you rightly point out, there's about 4 times as much peatland, under grassland for farming as there is, again, owned by Bord na Móna. So it's, a huge area and very, very important. And as you pointed out, and it's something which not a lot of people seem to realize, is there are very significant emissions from these grasslands which are drained. So anyway, moving swiftly along to our final speaker, a talk I'm very much looking forward to, Michael Fitzmars from the Turf Cutters Association. He's a man who was elected to Dáil Éireann. He has a huge amount of knowledge in this area, and I have had some very interesting debates with Michael over the years. So Michael, if you're ready for your presentation, the floor is very much yours. And he's talking about dealing with designation.
First of all, thanks, Niall, and to Katrina as well. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone here today. Firstly, I think we need to be clear that the turf cutters and contractors, and I'm speaking on behalf of those not as a TD here today, that we have supported re-wetting where it was done in basically consultation with the stakeholders, because we must remember, I've looked at a lot of the presentations today, very interesting presentations, but a lot of the ground that has been talked about is all private property. So you have to work with the different stakeholders. I know that Bord na Móna own a vast amount of bog, but other than that, right around the country, be it blanket bog or be it raised bog, it is privately owned. You have to work with the local communities and the local stakeholders and everywhere. And before the buzzword in the last year or two about re-wetting, in fairness to, I know that Maurice Aiken is on, and Francis Mackin and Ray Flynn and those, we would have worked with them, and I think something like 14,000 acres of re-wetting has been achieved in a lot of complexes around the country, which, you know, is a good thing. And that was done in working with the local communities, because bear in mind, as I've said, about the local property. Designation was the first part of a lot of these and a lot of the raised bogs, where a representative sample in Ireland was going to be designated. I've seen wording where it said it was the most pristine bogs in Europe, and I've done a circle there actually near me at home, and it's not my back door, but I'm just given the type of scenarios that has evolved. Glenamaddy is a town well known, there was songs wrote about it, but I've done a 20-kilometre circle around it, and between NHA's and SAC designation, there was something like 23 different complexes, which is a large amount. And bear in mind, in the west of Ireland, a lot of the bogs are untouched, because it was like biting at the toes of the elephant, where ordinary people owned an acre or two right around it, and they used that piece. So in that area, there's something like, I think it's 23,000 acres or 9,000 hectares in that area designated, and indeed a lot of designation around it. But the problem that we would have found is that there has been a lot of pushback from designation, and indeed a lot of pushback from doing works on bogs, for the simple reason the level of designation, when you re-wet something, for example, and we can look at the likes of the American wilderness, when you re-wet something, it ends up that basically it's abandoned. And what you need to bring with this, and I would always have argued this, is that you need to bring investment into areas as well to make sure that people are rewarded. There is also a knock-on effect. You know, when something is re-wetted, the area is abandoned and there's nobody there after that. And you will see some odd bits of spruce trees and stuff growing up. And it's like an area that no one lives or no one was ever in. But the reality in rural Ireland that people live around those areas, and people feel that the likes of the designations had a negative impact economically in the area. Turf cutting continues and will continue, and I think that everyone listening here today, and as chairman of the Turf Cutters and Contractors, if you look at the age profile that we work for, in about 12 to 15 years' time, in my opinion, the people that are cutting turf, new systems is coming on, and it's about 0.25 of 1%. So I don't think we should be getting hung up about them. But the one thing I would say is that for the farmers in the area, and bear in mind that there are farmers right around the edge of every one of the complexes, be them re-wet or be them in the future for re-wetting, need to earn a living. And when those farmers have to fill a heap of forms and do X, Y, and Z, and even in listening to the Department of Agriculture reps there today, and indeed Teagasc reps, when they talk about looking at the likes of the mineral soils and the peaty soils, and basically what we call shoring and drainage of our marginal land, which would be peaty land, what everyone must realize is that those farmers had to earn a living, live in that area, maybe have sheep or cattle in it, and they are working that land. And you cannot just say to them, well, now it's time to start re-wetting this, because it will be fought with massive pushback. And a lot of those farmers, and what we'd have seen, and this debate about carbon credits is going on, we would have looked at a lot of farmers that have large areas in what we call SAC and NHA, which was classed as being the most pristine in Europe, whatever. But there is no payback for them in the line of basically that they're carbon neutral in the rest of the farming they're doing, because obviously in a lot of areas where there's bog or peatlands, the land around it isn't of the greatest standard generally. But, you know, and it's all good and well, we describe in the area as a carbon sink, and that's great. But the state and the EU, in my opinion, has failed with supports to bring these people on. And I'm just showing an example of one designated bog, and you'll see the likes of the trees that grow in it. And I took, for example, Castlereagh train station. This is an idea that I'm floating at the moment, and would welcome any input from all the people that's looking on today. That's in areas like this, we have probably the highest designation in the country. We have probably some of the most pristine bog in the country, but it's basically abandoned at the moment. And I often thought, why don't we have an interpreter centre there, like there is in Clara? Why don't we have some vision between the EU, the Irish government, and the different stakeholders involved, that we'd have say a battery operation train now that Portimona is getting cleared in all the railways. Why don't we have an area that we'd make it basically the European or world raised bog or area in Ireland, to bring tourism in, to bring jobs, to get buy-in from the people in those areas, to be able to get involved with the community. And like, you know, if you have an access to a train station, you're looking at the most camera-friendly way probably of traveling. If you promote areas like Loch, for example, is one of those. It's the most unique turlough in the world, from everything I've read up on it from the so-called experts. And it's 2,500 acres of western raised bog and a turlough with it. And there's so many unique features in some of the areas that we haven't honed in on to get a buy-in from the people. And we could show them the uniqueness of where we have re-wetted, of our pristine bogs, but on top of that, the people that always done their tradition of basically turf cutting in a domestic. And when I talk about turf cutting, I'm talking about domestic turf cutting, to show off the way that we'd get the people in those areas to be more involved. But the one thing
remaining there, Michael.
Okay,
Sorry, thanks.
The one thing that farmers are concerned about is, you know, when you hear people talking about when we're doing an investigation into different soils in the country, and then you hear about re-wetting peatlands, and I think the language needs to be very careful in what we are saying. Because if you hear about re-wetting peatlands and you shored your land to raise your family down through the years, example, Listowel. If you go around Listowel, most of the dairy cows down there are walking on top of peatlands that has been basically put into grass. And if you look around most areas where there is good quality peatland, some of the areas around it has been brought for farming. And if you look at the likes of the designation, and this is what needs to be understood, why is there pushback from some of this? Because a farmer in that area to drive stakes or whatever has to get planning permission. That's not viable to keep a family going in those areas. We need to look at that and remember the one word of a thing called private property. The lack or the sense of abandonment by those people in a lot of those areas is one thing that needs to be addressed with, you know, the lack of support, the lack of a vision of the likes of an idea that I've been talking about, that we would, you know, that we in Ireland would be basically the place in the world to come to, that everybody interested in peatland would, if it's correct in talking about that it needs to, that it's the most pristine in Europe. We need to get that type of tourism, because land abandonment, like the American idea, will not work. We come from a managed landscape. We come from areas around all those peatlands where people are working, where people you know, live a normal life the same as they do in a city or whatever. And in my opinion, a buy-in would be had. It would create employment locally, and that's what's ferociously important. We talk about, you know, the great thing if the broadband comes to all parts of Ireland and people can basically work from home, enjoy the locality that they live in, but on top of that, get other opportunities to work and to enjoy is the other thing. And for small towns, there would be a knock-on effect. When I look at, you know, you look at most towns in rural Ireland, there's no bed nights whatsoever. There's no places to accommodate people. But if we could have a vision of where we're going in conjunction with re-wetting some of them, the bogs, you're not going to re-wet every single thing in the whole country. Let no one get carried away. But remember one thing, that if you don't bring the people with you, it is private property in Ireland. And whether people like to recognize it or not, private property in Ireland has a higher grade and higher regard than it does have in most other European countries, and long may that last. And I want to thank you for the opportunity in speaking on this.
There. Thank you very much, Michael, and I hope you'll stay with us. We're into our questions and answers session now, so perhaps all of the people who spoke in this session could, you know, bring back their show themselves on the video, and also just can unmute themselves as appropriate. I've been looking at the questions and answers there, and I'd like to go back to Michael really for the first one. I'd just be interested. One of the you know, people in the Q&A session asked about this very topical point about you know, the export of peat from Ireland. We do export peat from a lot of small sites for horticulture and so on, and at the same time it appears we're actually importing it. I mean, so what they're suggesting is, look, let's stop the exports and the imports and keep what we need for ourselves and maybe phase it out. I mean, have you had much discussion on that at a Dáil level?
Well, first of all, there's 36,000 tonne is my understanding of peat brought into Ireland this year. Obviously, because of the court cases, there was a big bang. That's been honest with you. The train stopped, to be quite frank about it. I agree with you wholeheartedly, Niall. Now it depends on where it's exported to. If mushrooms, if a mushroom company has a place in Monaghan and a place across the border, and they need peat, that's a totally different story than sending it to Germany or someplace. And in the turf cutters and contractors, we talk about turf cutting first of all. Peat is basically, you know, we talk about domestic turf cutting, enough turf for your own house, for your own fire. But in the line of peat as a public representative, we cannot just, and I've talked about this many times, you cannot just, and I listened to the presentation given by earlier on, and it is correct in saying we will need peat for a number of years. I have no problem, and I will say it openly, that we shouldn't be exporting peat, to be quite frank about it. We should be using it in our own country. That's the first thing. We should be trying to fill the gap that's there. But on top of that, we should make sure that the thousands of jobs that we're losing at the moment, that we bring a solution. And my understanding, and I'm open to correction, I don't want to preempt something or say something out of bounds. My understanding that there may be something soon going to cabinet or somewhere to try and resolve this issue, because my understanding of the cross-party committee that sat in it is that everybody involved understood that you cannot turn off the lights today and then say, hard luck everybody, that it needs to be on a phased basis, that they're looking at up to 2030, maximum 2035 like Germany has at the moment, and then you will bring in your other alternatives. And if there's other alternatives there before that that are workable, then that's fine. What you cannot do is leave an industry with lights out overnight, and I would support that fully.
Okay. I'll move on to Munoo, because there's been a lot of interest in your talk and lots of people looking for your email. Just a very quick question. What do you think is sort of the most obvious replacement, you know, for peat in the horticultural industry? If we're to do it over the next few years, what are we going to be able to use?
Well, one of the ones that is very easy is coconut waste, okay? But, you know, if you look at it, it is not very environmentally friendly. And there's also problems with, because it contains high levels of sodium, it has to be leached out, and it used to be leached out in Holland, but they banned that. And then it was being leached out in India and Sri Lanka. So that's one material that can be used without too much problem. But the prices are going up a lot as well, and the shipping and all that sort of thing also going up. The other materials that we are talking about, there are quite a few materials, like bark could be used, 100% bark, but there isn't enough bark available. And the other problem is that all the wood, actually, I think, maybe I'm not right, but what I think is that most of the wood that is being used to produce energy, and that is being subsidized by the government. So there's, even for wood fiber, there's not enough wood fiber available. So maybe we should be planting things like miscanthus or something like that grows very fast, you know?
Okay.
So there isn't one material that you could say could replace peat, not in the short term.
Yep.
Certainly by 2030, I think that if there's enough research funding available and a lot of work is done, I think it could be replaced, yeah.
Thanks, Munoo. I just cut you short because I just want to get everybody in very quickly.
Yeah.
Just need 30-second responses now from Hedda and Ken, maybe on the forestry issue. I mean, what's sort of the low-hanging fruit in that area, do you feel? I go to Hedda first, if that's okay.
Yeah, I might ask Declan to come in on that because he's the lead ecologist and he would have a better understanding than me.
Off you go, Declan. 30 seconds if
when
you
you
would.
say the low-hanging fruit, you mean like in these
terms of
Western
peatland
Peatlands?
restoration.
Oh, the low-hanging fruit is areas that are suitable to restore back to blanket bog and wet heath, quite simply. So it's a case of identifying those areas, usually the low-lying areas, for example. Areas on slopes tend to be more shallower and wet heath rather than bog, although you get bog in them as well. But plateaus and low-lying areas on the Western Peatlands, all along the Western seaboard, we would see as being restorable. But we would need there in that situation the Forest Service to grant us the licenses not to replant.
Okay, and very quickly, Ken, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with Declan wholeheartedly. We have, as Hedda mentioned, we have some EIARs and that with us for some of their projects. We have grant aid available for the conversion of native woodland, that kind of thing. We can now with the 2017 and 2014 legislation facilitate no replanting, and we can restructure these forests and that kind of thing as well. So yeah, I think I kind of welcome the creation of Coillte Nature as well as a sort of an agency to help drive that too, absolutely.
Okay, very positive indeed. I'd agree with that. And finally, just in terms of the farming aspect of it, just Michael Fitzmars raised an interesting point, which I'm going to address to Gary, just in terms of the reality of, all this grassland which is used for farming. I mean, surely we do have to bring communities with us and look at this in a careful and thoughtful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd probably echo what Michael says, that it's, it's all privately owned land, and we need to take farm stakeholders with us. And we're not necessarily, for example, talking about like simply reflooding land. I mean, there's other managements that you can do on that land. For example, reducing the amount of fertilizer. So simply the act of fertilization is probably boosting the CO2 loss from those systems. Or it could be occasional raising of the water table, or raising of it, but not all the way to the top. So there's loads of different managements that we can do. But I think Michael's dead right that we do need to take the stakeholders with us. Yeah,
and finally to Caroline, because I think you kind of are trying to bring the stakeholders with you in terms of farming. How successful has that been, have you found?
Well, we're just getting started, Niall, I suppose, at the moment. So time will tell, but we're working with 37 participant farmers in year one, and we'll have our first training workshops with them in a couple of weeks now. So that'll be our first sort of major point of, as I said, we'll be kind of explaining to them in more detail what we're hoping to achieve. And then we want them to tell us how they can see it working. And hopefully between us, we'll come up with something that can work. But also the local communities and the youth as well, a very important part of it. So we'll be working with them over the next few months.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And I want to invite Catherine back. And before I do, I just really, on behalf of everybody, because I think this is the last session as such, just the incredible work that yourself and Isolt and the whole organising committee have done. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand it over to you, and then hopefully we'll all have some lunch.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And a special thanks to Ollie for hanging out until the last session. And I've had a couple of really interesting chats with Michael in preparation for this event. And I think it's fantastic that, he's put forward the ideas. And I see in the chat that Suzanne Nally from National Parks has said, they welcome any community initiative. So I think you might be pushing, maybe the doors was open, but you didn't know it. So I think maybe keep pushing that way, Michael. And look, it's fantastic. We're not over yet. So I want everyone to take a pause. Pat yourselves in the back. I think you're brilliant. We're coming back God, please don't say the wrong time, Catherine. We're going to be back at 2:15, I think. Someone nod in agreement. Yeah. Yes, 2:15. And so go get a cup of tea. And if you can come back, that's fantastic, because we're going to have some sum ups from the 8 sessions that we've had over the last 2 days. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Alan Matthews, Minister Hackett, Andrew Jackson, who we heard from yesterday on the legal side, and then Andy Bleasdale, who's now Director over the scientific unit in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. We have Geraldine from the IFA, and we also have Nuala Madigan from the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. So I hope we have many voices covered. It's never enough though, because these conversations, we need to keep having them. And I think that's very clear from these sessions today. So thanks a million, Niall, and thank you everybody on this call and presentation. And I look forward to seeing you at 2:15.